Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. For those that haven't met me in person, my name is Fred Pitsadney, the founder and president of Focus Management, and I'll be presenting today's session along with Richard Jarofsky, a Focus partner. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. First, feel free to take notes during the webinar. However, you need to know that we're going to record today's session and it will be made available to you in a couple of days. Secondly, we'll be using the Q&A feature today to capture any questions you might have. So please enter your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We've set some time aside following the presentation and we'll get to as many questions as we can. 8 or 9 months ago, the tone and the subject matter of this webinar would have been so different. The focus would have been on planning how to successfully scale the next peak off in the distance. The peak represented the goals for the business. But then, with little warning, everything changed. In the space of a few short months, the COVID outbreak turned our world upside down. Our choices, our options have become severely limited. Now we all need to act very quickly, act decisively, and respond to changes that come at us just about every day as we move towards a new normal, whatever that becomes. To survive and thrive in today's unsettling and turbulent environment, we all need to rethink how we approach planning, managing, and executing our critical priorities. We need to take the tools that we're familiar with and reshape them to fit the world that we now find ourselves in. And how has that world changed? Well, for starters, it shut down. Planes stopped flying. Borders were closed. People returning from abroad were either placed in quarantine or voluntarily into self-isolation. You couldn't get where you wanted to go. If you did, you couldn't get back. Buyers couldn't buy, sellers couldn't sell, shippers couldn't ship, makers couldn't make. Every economy, everywhere, took a severe blow to the head. And on top of all of this, we don't know what's coming next. We are now in the second wave. I mean, is there another one? And how much longer for that vaccine? What about an antiviral? When will it be safe to go back to something we used to call normal? The pandemic is crushing many paradigms. How we make purchases and what we buy, how we do business and who we do it with, how our businesses operate internally, how we communicate with each other, and the list goes on. In the face of this, we need to recognize an important reality. Whoever acts fastest and most decisively will set the pace. And to do this, we need to rethink our approach to planning. In fact, to a great degree, we need to rethink how we think, and especially how we think about planning. So what are the goals for today? There are 3 of them, which are designed to provide you with a guide or a roadmap on how you can adapt your planning toolkit to today's realities. The overall goal is to introduce the RAD process that we have successfully used with our clients. We'll start by reviewing the underlying key principles that will help you move more quickly through your planning and execution stages. And we'll introduce to you some very specific tools and techniques that are immensely helpful in today's turbulent and uncertain world. Let's start where RAD came from, the fundamental value proposition behind all of our work. And then we'll cover the 4 principles. We're going to show you some very specific tools and techniques, the how-tos. We're going to talk about the RAD Fit. I mean, who stands to benefit most from taking the RAD approach? Every leader, whether of a business unit or a team within, wants the great execution of what matters most. Great execution, however, remains very elusive, as most, in fact, has been published that 75% still struggle with the execution of not only strategic, but operational and project plans. So where do organizations end up? Often it's in one of these other quadrants. Let's start with the orange quadrant, the poor execution of what matters most. This is where you find leaders with lots of frustrations who keep asking, why are we late? Why have we missed the timelines again? Why are there so many errors? Why? Well, you get the idea, lots of frustration. The yellow quadrant, the great execution of the wrong things, often leads to major embarrassment as the leader answers questions like, if we're so great at getting things done, why is the competition still eating our lunch? Why have we missed the fundraising goal? Why? Well, again, you get the idea. You've likely been there facing those kinds of questions. The black zone is that color for a reason. Businesses and their leaders don't last very long. Poor execution of the wrong things is a major reason that the majority of startups never see year 2. There are 3 elements that help leaders take their teams to the top right-hand quadrant, the great execution of what matters most. They are clarity, alignment, and commitment. Well, of what exactly? For strategy execution, it's clarity, alignment, and commitment to the long-term focus and direction of the business. Today, it's about identifying the critical priorities, what we need to do to survive. And for some, it's how to deal with unusually big demands for their products and services. The bottom axis is about ensuring clarity, alignment, and commitment to action for individual accountabilities. Not being clear and empowered to take action or to make decisions is, according to published studies and our own 50 years of combined experience with 400 organizations, the #1 blockage to great execution. We'll be addressing how to fix that during the webinar. For the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to be focusing on the 4 principles behind the RAD approach. But let me first describe to you what RAD's about. So RAD, if you take GEM, the great execution of what matters most, the models we went through, and add a good dose of speed and agility, then we get the rapid agile deployment, right? RAD. So let's look at those 4 principles that you can use to catch the wave and not be crushed beneath it. These 4 principles will be supported by 6 specific techniques and tools. Let's overview the principles first. First of all, engage your people in the process of planning and deploying your plan, and do it early. You know, we've heard a lot of talk about employee engagement over the last decade, mostly empty words, as most organizations are not really doing a better job at it than they were at the turn of the century. Not when it comes to real, meaningful engagement. Quickly means exactly that, quickly, not weeks or months, but days. You need to power through the execution of doing a few critical processes over and over and doing it right. Planning sessions should be short bursts, 1 to 2 hours long, not 1 or 2 days as we're accustomed to. You've all heard the saying, no plan survives the first engagement with the enemy, or variations of that theme. Well, it's more than a truism. A plan that fails to address the rapidly changing realities on the ground is worse than useless, is downright dangerous. Agility and responsiveness will rule. The 4th and final principle, nothing stops a great plan achieving the success it deserves more than the people charged with its execution only have a vague idea of the authority that they have to make decisions and to get important stuff done. We're going to cover how to fix that today. So these are the 4 principles. Let's dig into each of them and put some meat on the bones. There are two important reasons to ask people about their views and their ideas. The first is that they really want to be asked. They want to feel that someone actually cares about what they think. I mean, in their position, wouldn't you? The second reason is they know things that you don't. Not because they're necessarily smarter, but because they're closer to the action, closer to the customers, closer to suppliers and competitors. The last thing you want to hear during a debrief, especially of a failed initiative, is this: I could have told you that. You never, ever want to hear those words. It only makes sense that if you ask questions, you need to listen to the answers. Nothing turns people off more than taking the trouble to respond to a question only to be totally ignored. Most of us have had that experience. It's not very pleasant. That must not happen. It's critical to respond in some fashion throughout the entire process. Ask people early enough in the process to make their input useful. This is during the assessment stage, prior to putting pen to paper and creating the plan to take the business forward. This should be one of the very first things that you do. There are a variety of tools, many available at low cost, that can be used to gather this input. SurveyMonkey is one, and there are others. Keep it simple. Don't make it too elaborate or complicated. Ask a few questions, make them clear as to why the answers matter. We're going to look at a couple of examples in just a minute. Whatever information you gather, it needs to feed into your battle planning. Now, why do we call it battle planning? Well, because for us, it conveys a completely different level of intensity than conventional strategic planning. This isn't about winning the war. It is about achieving the success we need today that creates a secure and positive tomorrow. The first thing we need to do is quickly come to grips with the situation that we now find ourselves in, particularly in 5 key areas of importance. First of all, what is life today like for our customers? How are they being affected? How are their attitudes and preferences, behaviors changing? I mean, what new challenges are they having that might represent opportunities for us? Maybe their need for what we do is decreased or perhaps increased due to the present situation. For instance, the dramatic drop in commercial and civil aviation has had a terrible impact on companies that service and repair aircraft components such as wheels and brakes. Sales makers, on the other hand, who have the capability, have gained from the surge in demand for covers to protect engines as aircraft sit idle. What about our suppliers? We depend on them to operate our business. So how are they holding up? Do we need to be looking for new suppliers, new alternatives? We can't afford to have a supply chain that is unreliable due to capacity constraints. As borders closed, many experience logistical nightmares that still haven't been resolved, and therefore haven't established a secure supply of materials and components. As for our competitors, are they showing any signs of weakness that we can exploit? Have their service levels dropped significantly? Are they losing customers? Is there a fire sale out there? Maybe we can snap up some smaller companies that are struggling so that we can expand our reach. If we don't, someone else might. One of our clients, a maker of plumbing products, experienced a huge increase in demand for their product. In fact, the president says it's like trying to drink from a fire hose. And they experienced this demand because many of their competitors were unable to operate or had their supply chains disrupted. Their big challenge, and let's put this under nice problem to have, is how are we going to make enough of our product quickly enough to take advantage of this windfall? What about our people? How are they doing? This has been a very stressful time for many, perhaps all of us. Are we doing what we can do to help them through this? For example, one of our clients shifted work hours to help those who are having difficulty with childcare. Finally, we need to appraise our operational capability and capacity. Are we able to meet service level requirements and still remain cost efficient? If we have excess capacity, can it be redeployed to other areas? As an example, look at the number of companies that are making respirators and masks. Remember the survey I mentioned a few moments ago? Well, these are a few of the questions that we ask. What one thing within our power? I want to reinforce within our power. Don't ask questions that you can't do anything about. So what one thing within our power could we do to help you and others deal and cope better? The first thing you need to ask your people is, how can we help you? How about our customers? What can we do to serve them better? After all, a business without customers, well, it just isn't. What ideas do you have on how we can bond better with them? Perhaps become the trusted go-to company, maybe even indispensable. We might be suffering operationally, and our less than great performance is damaging our reputation and causing lots of frustration. How can we address those concerns and get better? The answers you receive need to be sifted, sorted, collated, organized, analyzed. Look for the nuggets, especially those that kind of seem off the page, off the wall at first. Include those nuggets in the conversation that you'll have with your core planning team. Set a very small number of objectives. You know, Richard and I work with lots of organizations, and one of the things that we see consistently are these long lists of objectives and goals. They could become shopping lists, almost impossible to achieve. So you want to set a very small number of objectives whose achievement will make a significant impact on the business. Make sure that they're clear, both in what they are and why they matter, and make them as measurable as possible. You can track your progress towards them if they're measurable. I mean, something like this: increase full order on-time shipment rate to 96% by December 31st, without increasing per unit shipping costs. This objective not only drives increased internal efficiency, it also benefits the customer. It's a win-win. Do it quickly. Lean towards action rather than that deep contemplation that we sometimes see in planning processes. We need to spend more time in planning sessions on creating action plans. Make your planning sessions short, 1 to 2 hours. 90 minutes is actually a great target. And place those sessions in a very tight timeline, whatever you can accommodate. Think about doing 2 or perhaps even 3 sessions in a week, especially during the assessment and planning stages. Keep it simple. We're going to talk a lot about that over the next few minutes, about keeping things simple. And it should be your mantra throughout the entire process. A beautiful plan on paper breaks down if people aren't clear on what they need to do and how the various elements all fit together to be successful. In a moment, we'll look at some very powerful yet simple ways of ensuring clarity of your plan. The most common cause of execution failure is that people don't know what's expected of them, what they're supposed to do, or the authority that's available to them. We're going to cover more about authority clarification in a few minutes. Complexity is a major, huge barrier when it comes to deciding what to do and then executing. Rich is going to cover some of the very simple yet powerful tools and techniques that you can use. The best thing is that you already have them in your toolkit. Richard will include how to make the planning and execution roles crystal clear. Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Fred. Good morning, everyone. Now, Fred has given you some background, a bit of an overview on RAD, including how it's connected with great execution of what matters most, which is the fundamental, call it value proposition underneath all of this. So what I want to do is add a little bit of detail, tell you a little bit more about how RAD works, what it looks like, let's call it from start to finish, and then also share with you a couple of the tools that our clients are finding increasingly helpful these days. Well, the first phase of RAD is really to get ready to do it because we don't want to engage the planning process without being properly prepared. So within this, there are 4 major activities that we perform. One of those is to identify who is going to be on that core planning team. Now, in a very small organization, it might be just about everybody. In a somewhat larger organization, it might be the senior management team, perhaps with a few other key individuals, and likewise in large organizations. So really, really critical up front to first of all identify them, and then secondly, orient them to the process as to what's going to be happening and how we're going to go about doing it. The second thing then is to say, okay, fine, who are we going to survey among the employees? Now, again, in a smaller organization, it might be everyone. In a larger organization, it might be some segment. It might be on the basis of level, within the structure. It might be more broken up into sort of functional areas. But whatever the case, we need to identify them because the next thing that we need to do is actually put that survey out. So we want to put out the survey, get back the results, compile and analyze the results, and then feed that back to that core planning team as part of their pre-work for the assessment stage. Now, this represents about 5 days of activity and is typically about a week prior to the initiation of the process. And it all starts with assessment. As Fred said, an important first step here is to really understand what's going on and what we should be thinking and talking more about throughout the RAD process. There are 3 work sessions here. And again, these work sessions are designed to be short, so they're not as invasive or as disruptive, and they allow people to get back to the things they need to do to operate the business. Well, the first of these work sessions looks outside the organization. It looks at our customers, it looks at our suppliers, it looks at our competitors. That's the external view. And then secondly, the internal view, looking at our people, what's going on with them, looking at ourselves operationally. How are things going? Are we doing a good job for our customers? And if not, let's talk about how we need to do a better job in the future. This is essentially a SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We often come up with a long list of things to talk about. The challenge here now is to take that and boil it down to those critical few priorities that really need to be part of the conversation from that point onward. Well, this is days 1 to 5 of a typical RAD cycle, meaning if we started the RAD on a Monday, by Friday, we've completed the assessment process. And now we've got that finger on the pulse and we've narrowed down the conversation to those really, really critical things that need to be fed into the next stage of RAD, which is planning. So the planning phase of RAD is also broken down into 3 work sessions. Now, of course, anytime we're going to do planning, the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, well, what are we trying to accomplish exactly? So this first work session within the planning phase is to establish what we call near horizon objectives. Bear in mind, this is not strategic planning. We're not looking out 18 months, 24 months, 36 months, or even further. This is looking at the near horizon, 3 months out, maybe 6 months out. Well, once we've got the objectives established, the next question to answer is, well, what do we need to do in order to be successful in achieving those things? And typically we start out with a very long list of possibilities, and I'll share a tool with you in a couple of minutes about how to narrow that list. But we need to select the initiatives that are going to be driven forward. And then for each of those, we need to establish the leadership. Well, then having done that, we're not finished yet because each of those initiatives is going to require some kind of resourcing. It might be people, it might be technology, it might be equipment, it might be funding, but whatever the case, if I've taken on an initiative, I don't want to get partway down the road and encounter the reality that I don't have everything that I need to be successful and have to stop. So we do it right up front. The other thing is to establish very clearly what authority I've got to get things done and to be efficient and to be quick. Well, within the RAD cycle, this is days 8 to 15. So essentially, let's think of this as the second week of the RAD process. And now we've got the plan, we've got some clear measures of success, we've got objectives, we've got the initiative ownership, and we've also established authority. Well, now let me share with you a couple of tools and techniques that our clients are finding so helpful these days. And some of these are tools and techniques that we've used outside of RAD for a long time, but we've changed how we implement them within RAD a little bit to focus on being quick, being agile, and really doing things at a high rate of speed. Well, the first of those is something that we call the 3W chart. And it's 3 Ws because it identifies what needs to be done, who needs to make sure that it gets done, and the time by when it needs to be completed. Now, often teams, they go through a long deliberation and they look at item number 3, make a decision, and the conclusion they reach is, well, you know what, it's really a shared thing. Robin and Tony both need to be involved in that. And our counter to that is really simple. It says, absolutely, Robin and Tony need to share in the doing of it, but one of them needs to ultimately take accountability to make sure that the action is taken, that it's made on time, and that it's of high quality. And so we designate that individual as being the prime. Well, some clients say, okay, that's great, 3 Ws, terrific. I mean, that's the plan, but there's more. I want to be able to capture and track and maintain more information. So for instance, what about resources? I mentioned that earlier. For each of those items on that 3W chart to say, well, what additional resources are required in order to be successful? Now, once that information has been captured, it can be maintained a number of ways. Could be an Excel spreadsheet, a Word document. Some will take that information, move it into a project management application for a higher degree of sophistication, because that's the way they'd like to manage projects within their organization. Here's another important tool. We call it rules of engagement. Historically, we've often referred to these as ground rules, meeting ground rules, et cetera. And we've gone with rules of engagement because it really fits with the notion of battle planning. And there are 5 I'm going to share with you because in particular these days, they're really very, very useful. And our clients say, absolutely, these are important things to do. And it's about managing the dynamics of that core planning team. And the first of those is make your point and do it quickly. Let's not have long conversations, which might be pleasant or not so pleasant. But the reality is we've got a short period of time to get a lot done, so let's do it quickly. Being happy or content with the idea that close is good enough for now. Teams often get trapped in this spiral of trying to get to the perfect answer when it's really not necessary. So let's settle for close is good enough and then do something. Keeping focused, avoiding sidetracking, using things like a parking lot just to capture stuff that's going to take the conversation off on a tangent, waste time. It might be an important thing to talk about. It may be more a question of, is this the right time to be talking about it now? Having one speaker, doing things virtually, online, really, really critical to make sure that only one person's talking. Because if there are multiple speakers, I can't pay attention to everyone and I don't know where the conversation is going. And that's true whether I'm facilitating that meeting or whether I'm a participant. And then finally, the 80% rule, very similar to number 2, except that this one really is about the fact that every decision-making process, every conversation reaches a point of diminishing returns. It becomes clear at some point that, we're really not adding any value to this. So could someone say, I think we're 80% there, and let's recognize that, let's record it, do something with wherever we've come up with, and then let's move on. So those are rules of engagement, and particularly well suited to these times. Here's a fun one, and it's fun maybe because of the name in particular. We call it Spitball decision making, and this is really along the lines of, let's throw things against the wall and see what sticks. Well, what drives the need for this is the fact that whatever objective we're talking about, there may be a long list of possibilities in terms of how we could approach it, the things that we might do in order to be successful. The challenge is, well, first of all, we can't do all of them. We don't have the capacity, the resources, the time, but also that some of them are simply better ideas than others. But how do we figure that out? Well, here's a way to do that. So the grid that I'm showing you here is a pretty simple one that puts value and benefit on the vertical and cost or effort along the horizontal. And it says, let's kind of break this up into zones. So we've got the best deal zone, the green zone in the upper left that says, great benefit, great value, very low cost. It's not going to take much for us to do it. That sounds like a tremendously good deal. You'd have to convince me not to do those things. We've got the justifiable zone, which is the blue. Those are things that you'd say, well, yeah, it's going to return us a lot, but there's also a fairly high cost attached to doing it. Now, it might be justifiable, especially if we haven't got much or maybe even anything over in the best deal zone. So those might become justifiable. You've got the why bother zone, the yellow zone in the bottom left. We'd say, well, it's not going to cost much, but on the other hand, it's not going to give us much back either. So I'm not sure it's really worth the bother. And then finally, the no way zone. These are things that, upon reflection, they're going to take a lot of effort or cost a lot to do, and we're not going to get very much back. So honestly, no way. Now, of course, in the middle, because, this is life, you've got that gray maybe zone, those things that we're just not sure about. But ultimately, the idea is to try to figure out where things belong so that we know what the best choices represent. Now, let me give you an example. We have a client that was looking at doing some improvements on the shop floor of their operation. They put together a team. The team brainstormed, and as is often the fact, that team came up with a very long list of possibilities, of ideas, 130 of them. Of course, they stood back and looked at the list, which was many sheets of paper long, and they rightly concluded that they can't do all of those things. And in fact, when they looked at the items, they said some of these, honestly, we shouldn't do. And in some cases, in fact, they conflicted. You couldn't do A and B because they would cancel each other out. So they went through a round of spitballing. They took that 130, worked it down significantly. And then they stood back and looked at that list and they said, there's still too many things. We still can't possibly do all of that, nor should we try. They did a second round of spitballing and came up with the gems and said, okay, those are the things that we are going to carry forward and implement. Those become the must-dos. So let me take you now to that third of the 4 principles, keeping agile and responsive. We got our plan, we've deployed it, we're implementing it, things are happening, but you know what, things can still change, including our expectations simply not being met by the things that we've chosen to do. So in order to know that, we got to check on progress. This could be 5-minute check-ins a few times a week. It could be longer, more significant checkpoints, maybe every week or 2 weeks. Well, whatever the case, checking on progress often so that we know where we're heading. Changing the plan if it's not working. With the quote that's attributed to Einstein of doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting a different outcome. Well, the reality is if the plan's not working, we need to change it. So let's do that. And then finally, the idea of calling an audible. And this comes from North American football, which I think we're probably all familiar with. And so just sort of visualize this. You've got a quarterback with the huddle, in the huddle, calling a play. They break the huddle. Team goes to the line of scrimmage. They go down on the line. Center goes down over the ball. The quarterback looks across to the defensive alignment on the other side of the line of scrimmage and concludes, you know what, that play that we are going to run, it's not going to work. And in fact, it might get us into real trouble. So the quarterback calls an audible, uses some coded language so the other team doesn't understand it, and yells out, and you'll see them yelling out first one side, then the other of the line. And what they're yelling out is a signal that says, we're not going to do that play I just called, we're now going to do this play. Well, 2 really important things about calling audibles. One, you got to do it really loud. Everyone has to hear it. Everyone has to know. And that's why you'll hear that quarterback yell out loud and clear, even in a very noisy, packed stadium. The second thing is that everyone needs to understand what's changing. They need to know what's going to be done that's different or what things need to be done now differently. That's calling an audible. Now, the 4th principle is about delegating authority. And for us, this is really about making sure that people have sufficient authority. We often use the term requisite, meaning the right amount, not too little, not too much, sort of the Goldilocks space in between, being really specific and clear. And then finally, finding opportunities to increase authority, because when people have more authority, they can do things more quickly and they can be often more efficient. Well, we often use an equation when we're talking about authority that says responsibility without authority results in frustration. If I've been given responsibility for an initiative and not enough authority to get it done, I'm going to find myself blocked and I'm going to get frustrated. And the fact is, it might put that initiative at risk. It might put me at risk. It might put the business at risk. And the next time someone comes to me and says, hey, could you do this? I'm thinking I'm going to find an excuse not to get involved. Well, the other way of expressing it is that responsibility without authority results in delays. It's going to slow me down. I'm going to have great difficulty meeting the timelines that are expected. In fact, I might not be able to meet them at all. So when we define authority, we like to keep it pretty simple. We use 4 levels. Level 1 says, just do it. Don't ask me, don't tell me. For these kinds of things, given these circumstances, just do it. Level 2 says after you've done it, you gotta tell me. It's an obligation, it's not a courtesy, it's not a, hey, would you mind? No, no. If I've given you this authority, you must come back to me and tell me after you've done it. Level 3 that says tell me before. And then finally level 4 that says, you know what, just bring to me what you think ought to be done or what the decision ought to be, and I will be the one to ultimately decide. So let me give you an example that I think helps clear up what we mean by this. And I'm going to use an example of someone that's going to implement changes on the shop floor of an organization. So here's one, first example that says basically spend within the budget, follow the policies. This is very vanilla. Just, you know, go ahead and do it. It's a level 1. Don't bug me. This one, approve new suppliers for ongoing operations. I'm going to give you a level 2, and here's why. If someone comes to me in the hallway and says, hey, what's going on with the supplier changes? I need to know. I need to be able to answer that question and not be embarrassed. So you better tell me after you've done it. Implementing changes that have minor impact on people, I'm saying, you know what? Just tell me before you do it. I might actually have some advice for you based on what I've experienced and based maybe on what's happening elsewhere in the organization. And then finally, things that are going to have major impact. You know what? Just come to me, tell me what you think we ought to do, and then I will ultimately be the one to make the decision. So that's a bit about defining authority. Now, we talk about it in the context of RAD and the implementation of initiatives, but in fact, this same approach to defining authority can be used for everyday responsibilities, for everyday roles. So in fact, helps to establish the boundaries and the limitations that people have to operate within, but also the degree of freedom that they've got to get important stuff done. I'm going to turn things back over to Fred now, who's going to talk about the RAD Fit.
Okay, so how does RAD fit in today's COVID world? Leaders from all walks of life are feeling pretty frustrated these days about how fast things are changing and how uncertain things are. They're worried and often uncertain about what they should be doing and how to do it. They're asking questions like, you know, what are my critical priorities? And what should I be doing them so that what matters most today gets done and gets done quickly? And then that's exactly what the RAD approach delivers. You know, if you look at the chart, on the left-hand side is the great execution of what matters most. Every leader wants to be in that top right-hand quadrant. If you add the speed and the agility that we need in today's environment, you get RAD, the rapid agile deployment. Okay, so for those that would like some professional guidance to implement RAD in their organization, here's the cost for a hands-on, step-by-step, let's avoid the landmines facilitation of RAD. For the basic package, which includes, first of all, the survey administration, the analysis and reporting of the results. Second is for getting your core planning team ready. Next are 6 working sessions delivered according to the schedule developed by your core planning team. And then we do 1 checkpoint meeting to provide a template to use for subsequent checkpoint meetings. The full no surprises price is between $15,000 and $18,000, plus of course the applicable taxes. This is for a completely virtual process. The $3,000 price range is to accommodate the survey administration, which is a function of number of peoples. Okay, listen, we have a few minutes left for questions. It's currently about 11:39. Richard, anything come through in terms of questions?
Yeah, Fred, here's a question, which is, does RAD replace strategic planning or should they complement each other?
Right. Thanks. We hear that question a lot. Thanks for the question. First of all, let me tell you in no uncertain terms that RAD is not designed to replace strategic planning. You still need that long-term horizon, the vision, the mission of where the organization is going. Now, it's quite possible what you learn during the RAD process, because as Richard mentioned earlier, we have a mini SWOTs built in to the RAD process because you need to understand the situation. What you find out about the situation may in fact influence that long-term direction. So we want to make sure those two processes are in alignment, but for sure you need that long-term direction. The other thing that we're finding is that very often clients are learning some of the tools and techniques in RAD that they can apply to their long-term planning processes. I mean, things like the Spitball decision-making, for example, or the rules of engagement, or the 3W chart. I mean, the simple things, very powerful, that can be used in strategic planning as well as they can with the short-term RAD planning. So for sure, keep your strat plan in place, but then you want to align the RAD process with it. Any other questions, Richard?
Yeah. Can RAD be considered a part of risk assessment or risk management, or can it strengthen the risk management part?
Well, I think the answer to both those questions is yes. Now, in terms of risk assessment, sometimes you want to do a little more detailed analysis than the Spitball decision making, because Spitball is designed to get through a list of questions very, very quickly so that you can make decisions and get on to action. When it comes to risk management, very often the X and Y axis are very similar because you want to talk about risk versus cost and benefit. So it can be used, but I'd suggest that to do a proper risk management, you really got to dig deeper and look at all the criteria. So it may provide you with a quick risk assessment, but I'd suggest you dig deeper.
All right. Thanks, Fred. That's it for questions.
Okay, great. Well, listen, thanks for the questions. Appreciate them very much. Let's just reflect back to the goals of the webinar and see how we did. First of all, we wanted to introduce you to the process, which we've done, the steps, the goals, the principles. We shared the key principles with you, and we also introduced some pretty practical and useful tools. So we hope that you found value in attending this webinar. Please feel free to contact us. Here is our contact information. And as a reminder, we've recorded today's session. I'll be sending that out to you in a couple of days. So listen, thanks very much for your questions. We're going to wrap this up. On behalf of all of us at Focus Management, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today. And thanks again, everybody. Have a great day.